So I had this really interesting idea on making something melt inside of Blender, and I realized that with a cloth simulation, you can actually turn the settings all the way down, and the vertices get to a point where they just start separating, and it looks pretty nice. And so it's like a melting effect, and what you can do is apply this to something hard, so like a rock, and make it seem like it's going from a very solid thing to a really fluid thing. And on top of that, I'm going to be showing you how to combine a material mask as well. So it really sells the effect and it looks professional and really nice.
So the first thing that I did was I set up the scene, and it's just a really simple scene. It has the plane and then how I normally do my camera setup, which is vertical. And then I got this really interesting background from Plexels. It's a great place. It's totally free to get videos like this. And then I will throw that into Blender to make a background. And then I got this rock because I knew I wanted to do this really interesting landscape. So I got this rock using the Sketchfab add-on, which is totally free from the Sketchfab site. So I just type in the URL from the model that I want, and then I hit import. And the way that you activate the login is just through, or the way that you activate the add-on is through a login. So started out there, I knew that I wanted to have the rock sort of melt from the bottom up. So I wanted a secondary rock to be under it so I could create these interesting ripples and different effects. And I don't normally do this, but I used the render preview mode basically throughout the whole thing just to make it faster and let me know that this is the iteration process that I was going through. So here we go. So with that video file I downloaded from Plexels, I put it in the Blender using a mesh to planes, and that add-on you can just activate in Blender preferences. But the really cool thing about it is it's very optimized clouds and lighting. So it really does the full package, and it's very easy to get it set up. So with the Plexels video, I just put it straight into the material node, which it already does by default when you import it. But you can also put it into the emission, and that turns it into a light. And so it's really great as like a background element. And that's kind of really popular right now too. So it just looks nicer when you put it all together. The big thing that I try to be aware of is making sure that my camera doesn't see beyond the plane. And then I go from there. I really wanted to do like a mirror lake. I thought that would look nice, especially when you already have a nice background that we just set up. So I just put on a glass material and a little bit of noise. And you can do a lot of things with this. You can make it more liquidy, add more texture. There's a lot of ways to mess with water. Definitely use a reference, so I don't use enough references. So keep that in mind. From there, I just duplicate the same rocks. So again, the cool thing about having a good asset to start with is that you can do a lot of things with it. So I know for a fact that we're not going to be able to see all the different angles from the rocks. And so if you position them differently each time, they're going to look like different rocks, and it'll be pretty believable. And so that's what I do. I just duplicate each rock and try to make it look nice in the background. And so the way that I'm thinking about these rocks is I'm positioning them so that they compositionally add up. So I know that it's nicer to see something bigger on one side and smaller on the other. It just adds that sort of visual contrast and interest. And that's kind of just from experience, but also you can use the rule of thirds and that would help you understand. But basically the idea is that you're not overcrowding the scene and your subject is pretty well defined. So I don't put a rock directly behind the main rock, and I try to work as hard as I can to make sure that's consistent. Onto the lighting. This is, again, another trend that I like. I think I see it pretty often, but it's just like a hard, soft light, if that makes sense. So it's really hard. And then you can just ever so slightly make the edges a little bit smoother with, I think, a 5-degree spread. And that just makes it look really nice. The other cool thing about that is when you shine it onto something like a scan, it looks a lot more realistic. Hard lights, like something coming through like a window or trees or something like that, tends to look more realistic, and it's harder for the eye to figure out if it's CG or not. So it's a very simple setup to making something more realistic. You can add to that with a number of HDRIs or anything. This is something recently I started doing with the color management, just going into medium high contrast from the relative start. And that kind of helps out a lot as far as lighting is concerned, because I used to oversaturate in Blender, and then I'd get to my video editing software and it would be totally undersaturated. So, or I'd do the reverse, I'd have way too much lighting, and that can really mess with a lot of your video editing stuff. If you're color grading, your lights will be totally blown out and look very noisy. So if you can do as much in Blender from the start, that's going to be really helpful in the long run. And then from here, I'm setting up just a really simple soft light. Again, that's just to fill in the shadows. You don't want things to be too dark, and you don't want them to be too undefined. So now that I have my scene set up, I'm actually going into the part of the cloth making. So the first thing is tries to quads, and that's super important because you want whatever you're using the cloth sim for to be quads as much as you possibly can, because it's just going to make the simulation that much smoother. So I do tries to quads, and then I put max face angles up to 90, and usually that gets just about all the triangles, but sometimes it doesn't. The main point is just getting a lot of them. You just don't want that many triangles. From there, I do a subdivision surface modifier, but importantly, with almost a lot of scans, most scans I would say, they are not connected. So again, in edit mode, I use merge by distance, and that connects every vertice that's close together, and that is almost always guaranteed to get all of your unconnected vertices. It is for me. From there, I go into materials really quick. I just wanted to see what a wetter rock was going to look like with our lighting, because it is like a rock that's in lake sort of setting. So I just put on a roughness from the same image texture and try it out. And it looks pretty nice. From there, again, the scene's relatively set up, and so I'm just taking more time to check again. And then from here, we actually start. So it takes me a second to figure this out. So from here, the big thing that you want to do is get something that has geometry. So not an empty, but actual sphere. And what you want to do is we're going to use the outside of the mesh to create a mask, but we also need the inside of the sphere to have mesh, because our vertex weight proximity is going to only account for the mesh that it feels or that it sees. And if you don't have a mesh on the inside of your sphere as well, it's going to create this sort of layered effect, and it's going to mess with your cloth sim. So the easiest way to do that is go into edit mode, hit duplicate, and then just shrink it down a little bit. And then from there, I just hit Shift R, and Shift R just repeats the function over and over again. Right here, I'm just trying to decide how far inside the sphere I want it to go. You don't want to just add a ton of geometry to the scene, because that's just going to make it slow. So trying to not do that. I think I ultimately end with just 11 duplicates, which is totally fine for what we're doing here. 10, 11. So from here, I turn off the sphere, turn it to bounds, and then take it out of the shading just so it's out of the way and we can actually see what the cloth sim is doing. And then I put on a subdivision surface modifier that's going to really make the cloth a lot more seamless. You want to be careful though, because your subdivision surface is going to slow down your computer. But the important thing is with the subdivision surface, you can't have them mismatching on top of the cloth sim. Otherwise it won't render. So you have to have, if it's levels in viewport is 1, you want to make sure levels in viewport in render is also 1. So keep that in mind. From there, we go to the vertex weight proximity. You want to go into edit mode and then make that group. And then from there, you want to start setting up your vertex weight proximity modifier. And all I do is use the sphere as a target. And then I hit it to smooth. Make sure you put proximity mode to geometry. I forget that all the time. So proximity mode to geometry, otherwise it won't do anything. The other thing to do now is to animate it. So the vertex weight proximity mask is basically going from blue to red, and that tells our cloth sim when to be activated. So the red part is when it's ready. because we have all these different striations, we have to adjust it. Actually, it might be blue. I think I get that wrong. We'll see here in a second. So now that we have that close together with a value of 1 and 0.9, that should really work for us. If you have too much of a gradient, there can be some glitches in the cloth sim because it technically doesn't do well with gradients. It's kind of an on or off sort of situation. So I noticed it was a little fast, so I pushed back the sphere that is coming over our rock here. And then I finally add a cloth sim. And you always want to start at the beginning because that's where everything starts. It uses the timeline to activate. Here's the real kicker though. In order to get it to look like liquid, you want to put everything down to 0.01. And you can put it at 0, but I've noticed it really gets glitchy at that point. 0.01 is really, really great though, because the vertices actually start splitting away and it really becomes liquidy at that point. You definitely want to try and use self-collisions if you can. It'll slow down your machine, but it looks a lot better. And then obviously you need collisions on your rock as well, because we're colliding with the rock. I'm putting up friction. It's because when it's liquid, it moves very quickly. And so you want to add some friction just to keep it from moving too fast. And then, so looks like I added the wrong values here. So it's actually 0.9 and 1. And there we go. So now the cloth sim is activating from bottom to top. And that's what we want. We want the rock to look like it's melting from the bottom. Make sure that your in cache is on the right value. For me, it was on 100. You want to put it on 240 or whatever the end of your timeline is. And then, or putting up the speed multiplier because I'm realizing that it is going way too slow with all the friction. So the speed multiplier just does what it says. It's speeding up the animation or the simulation. So it's going at 2 times the speed it normally would. And from there, it looks like we're really getting our liquid. It looks pretty nice. And the cloth sim is behaving how we want it to. From here, I'm kind of noticing that it is falling at different angles too quickly. And it wants to basically stick to one side. And so basically from here, I'm just trying different things. The beauty of cloth sim is that you really have to just trial and error it. And as far as simulations go, it's honestly one of the better ones because if you don't have your settings too crazy, you can keep trying different things and it'll normally behave how it should. You just have to be patient with it. And I would definitely suggest using low res things at first because it's going to be easier to iterate and go back and forth on different things that make sense. From here, I'm trying to position the rock in the right way because I realized that rock is going to be our final shape. And so it needs to make sense that it looks nice, but it also can keep the melted rock in the right place. And that definitely looks like liquid, especially when it's rendered too. The vertices move so quickly. It's not perfectly fluid. It's definitely something like melting that's pretty thick. But as far as fluids that would stick together like that, it makes a lot of sense because otherwise it would take forever to get that kind of detail on something that is a fluid sim, but also sticking together with surface tension and viscosity. So this really is a good alternative if you're looking for a cheap way to get something to melt. Trying to figure it out from here. Let's see. So one of the things that I'm kind of messing up on here is I'm realizing that the rock is the final shape of the cloth sim because it's kind of going over it, but it's hard to tell where the vertices are going to ultimately stop because the stickiness and the friction just have to be up so high. And then I ultimately decide to put a collision on the water. And I thought that when things melt or if they're really hot, they'll actually not float, but kind of stick to the surface as if it's hardening as it's falling down. And it kind of looked decent. And I put the permeability up on the collision, which is supposed to make it seem like it's going through, but it doesn't, which ultimately is totally fine because the cloth sim isn't bunching up necessarily and it's not causing it to crash or anything, so it seems totally fine for the most part. One last thing that I realized was that my mask was actually a little bit too far back, and so it was doing the front half of the rock first, and then that was melting, and then the back half would come, and then that made everything fall forward. And was trying to figure that out. So whenever you're doing this, try and watch it in the weight paint mode and then make sure the mask is even going from top to bottom. Otherwise, you'll get stuck with this issue where one side is just pulling down the other side, and then your melting rock is just always going to go down to that side. I think we're almost done with this here. Now we're finally on to materials, and this is, you don't have to do this, but I think it really sells the effect ultimately. So we're going to use the mask for the rock that we made for the cloth sim, and we're going to use it inside of the materials as well. And that's really great because we don't have to make it because it's already made. And then also it is going to sell the melting effect by transitioning the materials from one color to the other, or in this case, a sort of molten color from the rock. So again, it really sells it and brings it home. And then you can use this for anything. If you want to make it inflate, like we said earlier, this is a really great way to do that. And again, this is a core essence of all of it. But anyway, the big thing that you want to do is mix shader node, color ramp into the factor, then use the vector math in a link, and then use a texture coordinate with the sphere as the actual object in the texture coordinate. And that's going to basically take the location data that we have, turn it into a color ramp, and then that color ramp can be totally used in the materials or anything else that we want to do, which is great, again, because it's already made for us. The thing that you want to try to do, which is what I'm doing right here, is try and line up your texture coordinate or your material mask with your vertex weight. And the subtract node is really great for that because it pushes and pulls everything away or towards the original value. So we'll switch it top to bottom, or you can switch the color black to white, either way. And then there we go. So you have both the cloth activating and at the same time a new material, which again really sells it. And the only thing I did was duplicate what was already there. And then I'm just going to use the same image texture and throw it right into the emission. And once again, it's super easy, way more seamless than trying to make some crazy emission texture or glass material or anything like that. I throw on some colors that I like, and you could honestly stop it here if you wanted to stick with that rock molten effect. I would probably add some more colors if you wanted to. Maybe something that eventually goes into black as it hardens at the bottom. Whatever works. I think ultimately what I want to do is just make it a different material altogether, so it really looks like it's transitioning out of something. It's like this whole new thing. And so I'm going to add the transmission up. Transmission is basically just like making it see-through, and I think it looks a lot better there. Ultimately taking out the base color, because one big thing that impacts how glass looks is whatever the base color is. So if you have something that's a harsh base color, then it ultimately just doesn't let your glass be see-through. So I make it white and keep the normal and the roughness, and so that still kind of sells the fact that it has this rock texture. And then the last thing that I want to do, again, this is not necessary at all, but I think it just, again, helps to sell the idea that something's changing, something's happening. And that is to add in a little bit of detail between the transition. And again, it's just better to sell it, to continue making it seem like something at the point is happening, like rippling, or just there's some sort of change going on and now it's a new thing. So it's really simple. Using the vector math length and subtract, just pipe it into the vector of a noise node and then noise texture node, and then using same color ramp that you've already made, put it into a mix color node, and it just pretty much does what you want it to do. The thing that you might notice here is you just want to be careful with the color ramp, because you can ultimately turn off the material that you made, so it just clips the mask. Just play around with the color ramp. It should be pretty easy, and I'm not too worried about the different textures. I kind of wanted it to be more molten, more noisy, but it looked fine using stripes. And you can keep adding things into this. You can add another mixed texture node. You can add in another material if you wanted to. Just duplicate the vector math and turn down the subtract. There's really a lot of things you can do with this. The very last thing that I'm going to do here is I'm just going to animate the camera. really slow cinematic walk up just to make things not static. And this is just a really easy way to do it. I'm just moving it on the y-axis, keyframing both ends. I'm just doing some things to the guy at the end here.
Thank you for watching, and if you really enjoyed that, consider subscribing and leave a comment down below for any future videos or any other ideas that you might want to see from me. Have a great day.